She is a terrific author, has a brilliant Substack. We've been talking quite a bit, over the last, several weeks and months about all of these, terrific developments and also like challenging times about what, we're really seeing develop in the global economy. And Grace has some of these like brilliant takes. I think does such a fantastic job of breaking down some of these like, incredibly complex topics. And one of those incredibly complex topics that I want to start us on today is talking about warflation, right? So there is a very much so active war going on in Iran right now. Oil prices have, spiked in the U.S. The average now, is above, $3.50. We saw, just earlier this morning, the release, of one of the largest, oil reserves that we've seen kind of in recorded memory. But for many people, the war can feel really far off. Like, we maybe see a lot of these, articles and videos and stories of loved ones. But I think what Grace, was really breaking down was like how it's really starting to, impact so many of us at home, our wallets, the economies. And so, Grace, thanks so much for joining us here today. And yeah, we'd love to dive in talking about warflation.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeremy. And yeah, as you mentioned, I wrote something on this on Monday and then did a kind of short video explainer as well, just thinking about, right, how are these market fluctuations going to start affecting our lives in the short to medium term? And look, I think the really important context to notice here, important pieces of context. The first is that markets at the moment are very volatile. Financial markets are very volatile. Stocks have kind of been jumping around. We've got a big mess going on in credit markets at the moment that we can talk about in a bit. But basically, we're at what kind of market watchers would call what looks like a late stage of the financial cycle, where everyone kind of gets that a lot of assets are maybe slightly overvalued. So people have been throwing lots of money at lots of exciting new things. And in that sense, everyone's kind of looking around and waiting to see when the pin's going to drop, and when the market's going to start turning. Everyone wants to be the one selling at the right time. No one wants to sell too early, but no one particularly wants to be the one selling too late. And that kind of environment creates a lot of volatility because investors are all looking around for stuff that's going on in the global economy, jobs reports, commodity price spikes, and thinking, is this going to be the thing that punctures the bubble or that just turns us into a downswing of the financial cycle? So you've got already pretty volatile financial markets. We're also in this weird stage for the kind of real economy, which in some ways looks like a downturn or a recession, and in other ways looks like boom times. And this is what some economists have referred to in the US as the kind of K-shaped recovery. The idea being that particularly financial markets and within financial markets, a certain subsection of companies and assets have just boomed. And for the rest of the economy, things aren't doing so well. And you can also see this in terms of inequality, right? So the wealth of those at the top, which a lot of it is held in those assets that have boomed in value, has risen. And for a lot of other people, a lot of other working middle class households, things are really tough because labor markets are not looking so hot because
Right.
there's already a lot of debt having built up and savings having been drawn down from the last affordability crisis. That affordability crisis isn't really over because inflation up until recently has kind of flatlined, but that still means prices are rising. There's an overhang of quite a lot of debt. Wages, particularly at the lower end of the economy, aren't looking so good. So you already have like a relatively weak economy, relatively volatile financial markets, and into that steps this threat of war. Well, steps the reality of war, really. And so we've seen just extraordinary volatility in stock markets, in commodities markets. Bear in mind that all of this is exacerbated by the nature of financial markets themselves, where there's loads of investors who are all making bets about future prices as well as buying the actual commodities or stocks themselves. So in terms of oil prices, for example, we saw initially a kind of pretty, stable reaction, people thinking the war's going to be over really quickly. Then when hostilities escalated, huge surge in oil
Right.
prices, like really, really fast, almost unprecedented in recent years. The speed with which oil prices rose when it looked like that war was going to be was going to be much longer. And then over the last few days, Trump has come out and said, possibly in response to that market reaction and the speed with which that was reflected in rising petrol prices, for example, oh, actually, it's going to be over quite soon. And suddenly markets are all like, oh, no, it's all going to be fine. Let's just pretend things are just like they were, last week or 2 weeks ago and go back to normal when we were making lots of
Yeah.
money. So that volatility has been really interesting. And it will continue, I think, because we're at this point in the financial cycle where like one or two words from Trump or Hesketh or whoever can send markets, one way or another, basically. The other thing is obviously that background of kind of economic slowdown or the K-shaped recovery or whatever you want to call it, which is to say that there are a lot of households that are struggling and who cannot afford even the increase in prices that we've seen for oil, and how that's going to be reflected in other commodities and energy prices. They can't afford that even now, even if it kind of reverses, which again is unlikely. Things will remain somewhat elevated, even if the conflict does end soon. There isn't the space in the American economy and across Europe and the UK either for middle and working class consumers to absorb that increase in prices. And what's worse is that because we're at this stage for the labor market where people are being laid off, and we can talk about why that's happening a bit later, but people are being laid off. And so they won't feel confident enough to demand wage increases in line with inflation
Yeah.
because they'll be scared of losing their jobs, which means it's just going to erode their purchasing power. And then we've got the whole question of what central banks are going to do as well. I feel like I've already spoken a bit too much.
Yeah.
So
Before we
I'll,
go to central banks, I want to
mm,
touch on a handful of these things that you had mentioned already, which is, I think, this part about possible rising inequality as a result of this, right? That even just, right, that, small marginal increases, right, in, oil and gas prices can have these huge ripple effects, right, for people who are already feeling incredibly precarious in their, jobs, in their savings, right, in their ability to, pay rent. And this other part, which is that, as so many people are feeling precarious in their financial situations, you have this other part of, right, the economy, either people who are, kind of in the asset ownership universe, right, who own a lot of the stocks that have been able to somehow, stay buoyed through this environment, um, or who are in this like small subsector of the economy, specifically in the AI tech world or healthcare, that somehow have managed to basically prop up the entire economy, right? So when you remove a lot of those, or those two main sectors, we actually see a much more precarious and even worse situation than what we're kind of currently observing. And so I think that approach of like you know inequality making this really dangerous for some people, that some folks are actually not as worried about this because they've been able to kind of like stay in that top portion of that K-shaped
mm.
growth. um and then this third area of like just single words, right? 4 or 5 days, 4 or 5 months, it could take as long as possible, that we're hearing from the administration, that those are sending these like tremendous shockwaves through the system. And that is a really scary place for a lot of people to be in, but is our kind of current environment. Let's talk about what is kind of going to happen, right, from some of this, right? So we're seeing, as I mentioned, this, oil reserves are getting released. But as we are starting to see, oil, right, and kind of as a result, so many of these other prices start to rise. In your piece, you talked about the impact to agriculture, to fertilizer, right? What it means for the transportation industry, for shipping, like what is going to happen to the price of some of these goods? And then, yes, how do we think, central banks are going to respond, and what it might mean for homes, interest rates, start new businesses, auto loans, and all of that.
Yeah, so I think there's two things here that we need to go into. The first of which is oil, and the second of which is natural gas and the product related to natural gas that are produced in that process. So for oil prices, we saw like this huge spike and then like quite a sharp fall, right? And that has to do with a lot of things. Firstly, obviously, it looks like the conflict might not last as long as was initially thought. That matters because as a result of the conflict, a number of countries Iraq, I think Kuwait as well, a few others have basically taken a lot of their oil production offline. So they've just stopped taking oil out of the ground. That's because they've run out of storage. They can't load what's in existing storage onto new boats because the Strait of Hormuz has been blocked. So oil production was kind of stopped. If it looks like those kind of drilling areas can be protected from the conflict, either because it dies down or because they're, capable of being defended, then that will be less of an issue in terms of global oil flows. We've also had all of this news about oil being released from strategic reserves. Since the last energy crisis, a lot of states, China, the US, to an extent Europe, have been much more serious about building up those strategic oil reserves. So that is going to be create a buffer as well. And then we have the obvious fact, right? That the US is now a massive oil producer and energy superpower. So US frackers can continue to operate. And actually,
Right.
they benefit when oil prices rise because fracking is very expensive and, the associated drilling activities. That production of fossil fuels in the US is very expensive. And that's been a problem for them recently when prices have fallen. So prices rising is good for US fossil fuel producers. And obviously, that kind of insulates the US to an extent. It's also been important for Europe recently because of the reliance on, formerly the reliance on Russian natural gas. And obviously that's something that they are now increasingly importing from the US as well. But like putting oil prices to one side, because as I've said, there's kind of a certain amount of flexibility, I guess, within the system right now that would limit the direct impact on oil prices, even if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed for a really long time. The second issue is natural gas. This is like really, really significant for Europe and for a number of other Asian countries, particularly for Europe, actually, because liquefied natural gas, LNG, which is what is produced in Qatar, and what has been shut down basically is Qatar shut down that LNG production. That is what's called a marginal source of energy for a lot of Europe. Now, I don't want to go into this too deeply because it's quite complicated, but basically, the way that the system for energy generation, the way that this works in many European countries and indeed in a lot of countries around the world, is that the producers of energy will essentially bid to sell that energy to the grid. And the grid will buy the all of that energy at the highest bid that is required to meet all of the energy demand. So the renewables will come in and say, we'll bid at this price. Then the next source might be, liquefied natural gas, say. And if that energy requires being topped up more, then they will rely on those marginal sources of energy. And as a result of that, those marginal sources of energy can be price setters in a lot of markets. Now, that's the main thing. You don't need to get into the kind of complicated dynamics of how energy markets work. But the important thing is that for a lot of countries, liquefied natural gas, LNG, is the marginal source of energy. And so it's a price setter. So even if you can rely on getting other sources of natural gas, high LNG prices are going to reverberate throughout the rest of the system. That's really
Right.
important for Europe because it's already reading from the crisis in Russia, which obviously push up natural gas prices. That's started to level off now, and Europe has tried to diversify, in part by looking towards the Middle East as well for that LNG. That's now been shut down. So again, this isn't just about getting LNG through the Strait of Hormuz. It's actually about that production being completely shut down. And then a final thing that's related to that production of LNG is that in the production of liquefied natural gas, there are also a number of other commodities that are produced that are really important in agriculture. Urea, for example, is like a key component of fertilizer, and that is produced in the same processes as liquefied natural gas. And that is also being shut down just at the time that farmers need to buy that fertilizer to fertilize crops in the global north. So I think, again, there's been like a bit of a reset of the narrative over the last couple of days, saying, oh, it's fine, oil prices have come down. But that crisis in gas production and in fertilizer production is still very, very much a thing. And even if this war does end really quickly and those facilities come back online really quickly, there's going to be a backlog. And also, it's probably not going to end as quickly as everyone's thinking.
Yeah, and I thought this connection between the war and these other industries and in Europe in particular, as you mentioned, and like this kind of being, the core time for so many of these farmers to be, fertilizing their farms, working on crop production, that if they aren't able to do that now, right? I think it was that, I think it was that JP Morgan report that you had cited basically saying that, egg prices, right, we should expect those to rise, in the next month or so, that pork and chicken, we should expect to rise in the next 6 months or so. And right? The way that this war shows up in our grocery stores is going to be very real. And yeah, that it's not just about, cars or our homes. And in the US, it's also so interesting, like how many different parts of our, grid are sort of supported by these, different forms of, kind of energy, right? Northeast being a lot of liquefied, natural gas, less so than we see, in the southern parts of the US. And so those impacts are also going to be felt, disproportionately, not only in a global stage, but also regionally, within just the US.
Yeah. And the other point about that is the impact on the price of logistics, of just shipping things around the world, right? So if we're talking about knock-on effects, we don't just want to talk about oil and everything that is produced using oil. We don't just want to talk about LNG and all of the other products that come out of that process. We also need to talk about the fact that jet fuel prices have gone up substantially, along with obviously all of the fuel used in every other form of global transportation and logistics, at the same time as the Strait of Hormuz is closed, and also insurance premiums for those ships trying to travel through that strait have increased substantially in the context of a global shipping industry that is highly, highly oligopolistic. So a small number of very, very powerful firms have enormous price setting power. We saw during the last crisis, the last global shipping crisis, which obviously resulted from ports being shut down during COVID, that effect of the rising cost of logistics led to massive profits for the global shipping companies and had a direct impact on inflation on the shelves, but not for like a
Yeah.
year later. So that is going to be showing up as well, like in the kind of medium term.
Perfect time for US, midterms for that to,
Yeah.
yeah, take place. Um, we've alluded to it several times now, right? There's this universe where, as these prices are rising, central banks will be inclined to raise interest rates. That's happening in this, universe of a high uncertainty in the economy, right? In the, US, for example, more than 50% of homeowners have interest rates below 4%, right? So you have this real challenge right now where, the US supply is not keeping up with our housing demand. You have so many people with these lower rates who do not want to, move out of their houses to just like have to spend, higher rates. Are we going towards this universe where we think that, as right, maybe food prices are rising, transportation costs are rising, that we're also going to see a rising in, interest rates that will in fact impact our, yeah, mortgages, auto loans, and like ability to get loans to start new businesses? Like, is that the universe you think we're headed towards?
This is a really tough question because it's very hard right now to to imagine how central bankers are going to react because of particularly in the US, they have to balance two things. They have to balance concerns about inflation and concerns about unemployment, right? So the Fed has this target to keep inflation within a certain target, but also to keep an eye on unemployment as well. In Europe and the UK, those central banks focus more on inflation and just kind of keep those ideas around where we are in the economic cycle by looking at unemployment in the background. But for the Fed, there are these two issues, right? The first of which is they thought inflation was going to be easing off, which was kind of made sense because it seemed like the labor market was also becoming a bit looser and unemployment was maybe going to rise. For that reason, alongside potentially some pressure from Donald Trump, it looked as though the Fed was maybe going to give us another interest rate cut before the end of the year. In
Right.
Europe and the UK, there were like significant bets on another interest rate cut in those places, because particularly in the UK, growth's been pretty bad. In Europe, it's been slightly better, but structurally, it's not looking particularly good in a number of places there either. So there was this sense that okay, we're getting to a point where central banks are going to start cutting interest rates because inflation, while it is still above target, looks to be easing off. And also we have these pressures in labor markets. Now you have this threat of stagflation. This was something that we saw during the 1970s when you have the combination of high inflation and high unemployment. That, according to the models that central bankers use to understand the economy, isn't supposed to happen outside of a really big shock, right? Which is the kind we're seeing right now. Like oil prices, for example, oil suddenly becoming more expensive and that creating inflation across basically the whole economy. That's what happened in the 70s, thanks to kind of OPEC after the Yom Kippur War, just like really consolidating control over oil markets. And it took place at a time at which unemployment was already pretty high. So that combination was really challenging for many domestic economies and for the global economy as a whole. And that same threat looms today, because the
And
way
also worth acknowledging that that was also like some of that OPEC oil crisis was also in 1970s Iran war too that was
exactly,
occurring. And so
yeah,
the, history might not repeat, but it does certainly seem like it's rhyming right now.
100%, yeah, yeah. And like, think what is kind of interesting and of concern right now is the kind of model that you would use as a central banker to determine how to set interest rates is basically a model that looks at demand in the economy and looks at where the economy is in terms of its usual cycles. And you would expect when everyone's buying lots of stuff, demand is really high, investment is really high, then you get inflation because there's lots of demand and maybe not as much resources to be able to meet that demand on the other side. And that's when you increase interest rates, right? The idea being that you cut demand, you make it more expensive to invest, which then reduces the amount that everyone can kind of, throw into the economy, reduces the amount of new workers that can be hired, reduces the amount of demand all in all, and just kind of like eases off that hysteria almost in the economic cycle. When you get to the other side, which is people are a bit anxious about the future, they're not spending enough, businesses aren't investing because they don't think good times are going to be ahead. Maybe there's relatively high unemployment because of that absence of business investment. Then you cut interest rates, you make borrowing less expensive, which encourages businesses to invest, encourages them to hire, etc. When we're in this situation now, where you have a pretty flat economy all round in most of the rich world in
Yeah.
particular, alongside this threat of inflation that comes from an exogenous shock, historically, central bankers, and again, I have a lot of arguments as to why this is, but historically, central bankers have prioritized combating inflation over the threat of unemployment. And they are more likely to do that now because there were accusations during the 2022 crisis, sorry, of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that they didn't act quickly enough to raise interest rates to tackle inflation. And that was why we got the cost of living crisis. I think that's a misinterpretation of what happened. But I think now we're going to potentially see them being what economists call more hawkish about interest rates, i.e., allowing higher levels of unemployment in order to tackle the threat of inflation. And that is, yeah, not going to be good for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah.
I'm
I
also interested in your take on what higher interest rates are going to mean for the US economy in particular, just and inequality, just based on what you've said there as well about the dynamics of the housing market.
Yeah, I before responding to that, I do want to just acknowledge one thing, which is that Grace, you are one of these very special types of economists who can do such an incredible job of like explaining complex topics in a very clear
I
way. I
don't
think
even really see myself as an economist, to be honest.
well, I very much so do because I don't know. I spent a lot of time working at the Federal Reserve and your
Oh, yes, so
ability
you
to
know all
like
of
just
this.
explain, what central bankers are trying to do, how the economy operates, this sense of like, we would expect this type of causation to occur and that it doesn't is, yeah, incredibly valuable in a time where it is so difficult to really understand what is going on in the economy. So I am very much so grateful for your wisdom on that. On this part about like what I kind of think is kind of going to happen with some of this. the Federal Reserve is under a ton of pressure right now, right, from the administration to respond in certain ways, to think about, this like, crisis of prices that, the Trump administration is not really willing to talk about as an affordability crisis, even though I think many more folks on the left are doing that. But I think you have these two main issues, right, that are probably going to emerge from this. One is, you know, exacerbating our already existing housing crisis, right? So whether rates drop at the pace that we expected is, it's hard to guess on this. But if there is a slowdown of that, then right, our continued inability to increase supply of housing, right? We will have so many of these people who have these low interest rates will, yeah, continue to refuse to, move out, to spend more money for, possibly, less good, product, or not as new product. And then on that second part, right, of the dual mandate on the labor markets, this cutting that we're seeing of so many jobs occurring right now, from, so many of these like tech companies, large companies, kind of under the guise of AI. Some of it, I believe, is just like under uncertainty in these economic
Mm.
environments, right? And trying to tighten our belts. I think we're going to like, yeah, see, continued struggles in the labor market kind of as a result of some of these things, and also real challenges for new graduates. So we see in this,
Mm.
22 to 25-year-old range, some of the worst, labor markets that we've seen, in quite a while. And this like flipping where it's actually much more difficult to be, hired as,
Mm.
in this 22 to 25 age range. And as, central banks continue to like worry about the economy, what we're going to see with this, like, eggs have become such this rallying point, right, for a lot of this discussion of like what is happening in the economy, like somehow this, case in point of this, much larger challenge. uh, I, yeah, similarly worry that we are not going to focus as much on, so many of these workers who are really just getting, again, only hiring happening, in like, the tech sector, even though there are a lot of layoffs in the healthcare sector, um, and less growth there at a time where there's maybe this over indexing on the prices, particularly at a time where like this war was self-imposed, right? Like
Mm.
it doesn't necessarily feel like we, had to be, bombing Iran at this point, right? Where we talked about this nuclear deal that Trump decided to rip up, which Obama had already negotiated, and trying to like negotiate many of these same points too. We're creating all this economic fallout in the wake of that. You touched on something earlier, which is about these, certain companies, or institutions that, you mentioned fracking, for example, in the oil companies that are maybe able to turn some of these, um, uh, you know, oil wells right back online. They're able to come back online that when, the price of it is above $100, it's actually
Mm.
worth it for them to, hire people, start drilling again. Who benefits from war? You've written quite a bit about like, vulture capitalism, the
Mm.
extraction economy. Yeah, who stands to benefit from this war, right? You talk a little bit about like some of these oil companies, but who else is stands to gain a tremendous amount? Again, thinking about these, maybe handful of folks or perhaps in this like upper echelon that can see some of the gains from this.
Yeah, it's funny that you asked that because as soon as all of this stuff started coming out, I started making a list based on all of my reading. I kind of have it here: war winners and losers. And it was like up, crude, liquefied natural gas, defense stocks, initially gold, the US dollar. That's something we can talk about as well. Down, airlines, banks, initially stocks, initially treasuries. Emerging markets have been completely tanked, particularly oil importing emerging market
Mm.
um, currencies and also stock markets. Then I had a few other things that I just noted as well. That there were specific challenges in a number of different markets which were going to have knock-on effects. So fertilizer was one, aluminium was another that was going to be potentially really disrupted. Um, Taiwan being really reliant on energy imports could potentially have disrupted chip manufacturing if
That's
Taiwan wasn't able
fascinating.
to access energy, and also US frackers, their stocks rose significantly in the wake of that initial announcement. So along with things like, the publicly traded shares in like Aramco, the Saudi oil company, even those companies that were like, oh, we're going to struggle to meet demand, just the fact of like rising oil prices benefited them a lot. And I mean, the initial like thing of fossil fuel stocks, defense stocks, the dollar shooting up, and then emerging markets crashing, you just looked at that and you thought, wow, this is really just like the bad guys coming to cash in. And like Trump, obviously, you know, these people are very close to Trump. A lot of the people within, for example, the US fossil fuel industry, in some of those big global fossil fuel companies, obviously the defense sector, these people are extremely close to him. What is interesting, though, about particularly the initial market movements was that impact that it had on the dollar as well, right? Because Trump has made it his whole thing to say, we want a cheaper dollar. Why does he want that? Basically, because he has this kind of fairly simplistic understanding of how I would say international currency markets work, which is to say, if we can get the dollar to be less valuable, then more people will buy American exports, which will be a boost to US manufacturing, which will create jobs. That's his kind of alleged justification for that. And it also um, helps in this kind of narrative about the trade war with China, because if the dollar is undervalued relative to countries with which the US is trading, that makes imports seem less expensive. And obviously, the US exports seem more expensive. Now, what's been really interesting about the movement of the dollar under Trump is that it started to become a little bit more counterintuitive. Usually, because the dollar is like the world's safest currency, it is the world's reserve currency. Central banks hold it. It is a currency in which so many transactions are undertaken. Usually, when people get scared, they buy more dollars, right? And that initially did start to happen. But people are also moving out of the dollar, right? They're hedging against the dollar in some ways,
Yeah.
partly because central banks are using it less, partly because a lot of trade is now taking place in currencies other than the dollar, and partly because there is a huge amount of uncertainty about Trump and his kind of intentions for the dollar, I guess. And that was relating to both kind of the independence of the Federal Reserve and what compromising that would do to currency values, but also just like egregiously irresponsible spending, like massive tax cuts for billionaires and starting random wars that cost billions of dollars a day. Like, I'm not one for saying, oh, irresponsible governments should be punished by having their currencies traded against. But people are looking at that and are thinking, this is really unsustainable spending. And there is such a thing as sustainable and unsustainable spending, right? I think there is often a tendency on the left to be like, oh, all government spending is good. It's not. When we have like massive
Yeah,
subsidies
great.
for, irresponsible corporations, for fossil fuel companies, for defense companies, and we have governments literally spending tons of money on war, even if that creates jobs, which increasingly it doesn't because these wars are often automated, it's not a good thing. So yeah, like the reaction of the dollar, I think, has been interesting. And I think that's also been one other thing that Trump has been watching alongside oil prices that will have made him think twice before carrying on and like really getting the US involved and invested in a long drawn out war. Because there are a lot of reasons why he would want to do that. It's like Thatcher invading the Falklands when, people were pissed off at her. It makes him look strong, makes it look powerful, it rallies people around an external enemy, like all the classic populist lines. But if you have rising oil prices in the context of a cost of living crisis, that massively screws them over. He obviously underestimated the extent to which markets would react to that and thought probably that the US could step in and provide that extra supply. And also, if it undermines his intentions for the dollar and the trade war, which is really what his whole presidency, I think, in terms of the economy has been about. I think that was a big part of what made him think twice.
Right. I think, off of the heels of, right, Maduro in Venezuela was feeling very empowered, right, to
Mm,
invade, and, start this war. And I think the, political significance of Iran and some of the work that he was trying to do there. I think your points also about like dollar strength rings a lot of like some of his intentions by way of China and thinking about
mm,
some of this war in the Middle East and even dollar strength as like our ways to put pressure on China. But you're 100% right. It has created all of these, knock-on effects, whether he, was aware of them or not. Right. The point you made about Taiwan, right, and possible
Mm,
weakness that we're seeing there, and chip challenges there too. This rising cost of living, amidst this affordability crisis is so challenging. But at least he gets to, make many of his cronies very wealthy in the meantime, right?
exactly.
We talked about, the arms dealers, right? The oil companies, a lot of these, large shipping magnates. Many people in, the chat were talking about DoD contractors as well.
Mm,
And also, the someone else in the chat had mentioned this point about what this war will do to the, green energy sector, right? If we see this increased investment in oil and LNG,
mm.
we maybe see a turning away from, some of these really significant investments that we have seen, in solar and wind over the last several years. Um, and when we're also facing this, crisis of rising utility bills at home, right, in certain parts of the U.S., at least, some of those, green energy, sources have been really helpful for mitigating, some of these, downturns or, kind of like price shocks, particularly when a large, data center can come to town. But I think if this war is, sustained, as I personally think it will be, these pains are not going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah, this is just the big question right now. Is it gonna carry on? And like in some ways it very much is obviously going to continue, right? Because, you know, yes, they've killed Khamenei won, but that was never going to bring down the regime. And in fact, there was I read an article a while ago saying that there had been a report that had been produced by some part of the U.S. intelligence apparatus. I can't remember which part specifically, saying even if you take out the leadership, you will not be able to remove the regime completely overnight. This is Iran is a large, complex state that has existed for a long time, that has um not just like it is not just embedded within Iranian civil society and has, strong and powerful state infrastructure. It also has its own sources of legitimacy, although those have been being eroded for quite some time. And what's interesting about this conflict is that it might actually undo that process of declining legitimacy that the regime has been experiencing for some time now by creating an external enemy. Trump should know this better than anyone. It's why he's doing this war. It's because people rally around the idea that, we're at war against some evil foreign power. Obviously, for a lot of Iranians, including those who really don't like the regime, they're not going to look at this and think, amazing, we're being droned and acid rain is pouring down from the sky. Thank God for
Yeah.
our American saviors. Like, that's not how these conflicts work. And the danger is that he actually ends up strengthening the Iranian regime around, a new figurehead. Because again, that infrastructure is there, that depth of personnel continues to be there. And because the Iranians have basically spent a really long time doing what a lot of countries that are not within the US's orbit realize they have to do, which is basically invest in asymmetric warfare. Like the Iranians knew that they could disrupt um, global shipping, disrupt the global economy, and particularly disrupt like normal life amongst all the other Gulf states that are close allies of the US, using these forms of asymmetric warfare that rely on drones that can often get around missile defense systems. Um, and they exploited that ability to do that pretty successfully. And they will probably continue to exploit that ability to do that fairly successfully if this war continues, even if it kind of, take like tones down somewhat in terms of the salvos of weapons that we're
Mhm.
seeing being pushed from one country to another. So yeah, like I agree with you. I don't think it's going to end anytime soon. And what's crazy about the market reaction is that it does seem like, as of today, investors in commodities markets and stock markets have just basically been like, everything's the same as it was now 2 weeks ago. Like we can
Yeah.
just kind of carry on and nothing's going to change. I don't actually think anyone really believes that. I think it's one of these things of, how like this whole dynamic of like bull and bear markets It's not really driven by reason, it's driven by emotion. And that whole idea of a bull market is a market that's driven by greed. And it's just like, if I can make money, even if I know everything's going to shit, I'm going to carry on making those bets that allow me to make money.
Do you think that's what is going on in our like these, even Monday, right? We saw these huge, right, giant drop and then kind of bounce back. Maybe this inability to update. But when I was at the Federal Reserve, we spent a lot of time talking about signals and are we looking at
Mm.
the right signals right now? And I was on one of these, kind of post 2008 financial crisis teams that talked a lot about like in the lead up to the crisis and even like kind of during it, so many of our indicators of the economy were flashing green, right? The things that we were looking at actually said that the
Mm.
economy was in an okay position when in fact it really wasn't. And so, an example is like there were really few measures of what was going on in the insurance sector, right? And we didn't have this clear sense of like how critical AIG was, to what was going on in the banks.
Goldman Sachs
And
knew though.
they did, and they didn't want to tell us at the time. But this ability, like, and our understanding of signals, right? Like, does it feel to you like some of this is maybe we don't have the right signals about what is going on in the economy, or it's this other area that you're talking about, which is maybe more greed driven, right? That we see this ability to cash in on some of these, tremendous shifts on, these amazing, these whatever sectors that we think are about to perform amazingly, whether it's shipping or airlines or the or Palantirs of the world, or is it that we're actually like we're our ability to actually see what is going on underneath the hood feels like it's missing the bigger picture?
I think so in the short term, I do think the dynamics are driven more by just like th- the the speedier traders who are looking at how they can make a quick buck. If we're thinking
Yeah,
about like long-term market movements and long-term investments, it's almost like a completely different market because we're talking about big institutional investors who don't move their money around very often. But if we're talking about like short-term market volatility, then we're thinking about people who are trading on sometimes like tiny signals, often as well, by the way, trading that is automated in some way, which can really exacerbate these swings. Because, once everyone crowds in and you get a signal that says, okay, the market's going down, then you get all of these positive reinforcement dynamics when you have those really fast algorithmic trading processes. So that's definitely a part of it. But like if you are a trader who's looking at the market, not just like every day, every second to figure out what's going on, and you are hanging on the word of, you know, like Jerome Powell when he says, like, we might be looking at this particular area of the economy, and you think, oh, okay, he's going to hint that we're going to cut interest rates, right? And you then don't think, the long-term implications for the US economy of him cutting interest rates. You think, what is everyone else going to be doing in response to that? And okay, he's
right.
going to be cutting interest rates, so maybe we sell the dollar, like sell, like make a bet against the dollar in the short term or something, right? Because you're again thinking about like what everyone else in the market is doing. And I think that's probably exactly what's happened here. Like initially, everyone was looking around and thinking, okay, actually, no, things going to be fine. Then suddenly we had like the Qatari energy minister come out and saying this is going to be a big crisis. We had Trump come out and saying we want unconditional surrender. Traders would have been looking at that and thinking, okay, everyone else is going to be thinking the same thing as me. Oil prices are going to rise, so I'm going to bet that oil prices are going to rise, which creates a self-reinforcing dynamic. Then suddenly the mood changes and everyone looks around and thinks, oh, actually, it's not going to be as bad. So they start to unwind their bets and make different bets. And that I think is really what drives these movements in the short term. I don't think that what we're seeing in markets right now is a reliable indicator of what things are going to look like. I think we're going to see way more ongoing volatility. But in terms of like, are we looking at what's going on under the hood of the economy, right, to be able to understand it from like a policy perspective, say? Um, yeah, I think that is. I think policymakers potentially aren't, but I think a lot of people who are invested long term in financial markets know this because we've seen this like big stacking up of bets in basically that companies are going to go bankrupt. and that the lenders often in the private credit sector that are lending to those companies are going to get into trouble. I think often, and you will have seen this before the financial crisis as well. There will be participants in those markets, generally like the ones with the most information, often just the wealthiest, the ones who can pay for the most advice and who like have the closest connections, who know exactly what's going on. And I think you already see a lot of bets piling up in financial markets that suggest,
Or on Kalshi and Polymarket, right?
yeah,
All of these.
yeah,
Yeah.
also that, that suggests that like the US might be going into a recession if we're just thinking about things like corporate defaults, right? Um, so I think like some people know, maybe other people are in denial. Maybe our policymakers are in denial. And I think actually a lot of people who are making important decisions just don't really care.
Mm,
Like, that as long as the stock market line goes up, they can basically say to everyone, you're getting richer, the American economy is getting richer, everything's going to get better. And they don't really care what's happening under the hood with regards to unemployment or, wages or any of that sort of stuff. Because we all buy this narrative that when the stock market goes up, we're all happy and everything's going to be fine.
right. And I think that narrative can hold unless it's built on a house of cards, right? Unless that something of the kind of fundamental nature of the economy cracks and everything else kind of falls down around it. And there are so many historical examples that we have touched on already, whether it's the 1970s stagflation, right, or the
Mhm.
2008 crisis, even Venezuela much more recently. But one example that very much so comes to mind here is what feels really different now, right, is World War II, and this notion that you can have
Mhm.
this tremendously booming economy as a result of war, right? We have
Mhm.
so many new jobs that get produced, so many more factories that come online. It's actually a tremendous boom for, female employment as well as, men are getting, shipped abroad. You have so many women who take over these factories. It was great for childcare as well, right? You had the Lanham Act, which actually first, was the first time that we actually federally fund childcare in the U.S. And then post, World War II, we have this fear of the industrial, military industrial complex. This feels really different, right? It does not feel like we are going to see this tremendous job boom, whether it's because
Mhm.
we are being told the narrative that this war will be short, or because it feels like maybe war is increasingly being, like automated or fought in a cyberspace or just with unmanned drones. Like, can you talk a bit about like what has like really shifted, why we maybe think we're going to see like these actually really bad labor impacts from this war, or if maybe we will see some of that growth accrue to a broader set of industries in kind of like some possible upside scenario?
So yeah, the whole war Keynesianism argument, I mean, it was always kind of based on, it wasn't untrue, but it was based on a very particular historical context, which was a historical context in which workers were really well organized and they could demand good jobs, and in those jobs they could demand higher wages. And actually the Second World War fed into a lot of those dynamics. The organizing that had been taking place amongst major labor unions in like the 20s 30s in the US and the UK and across Europe was massive. They kept getting fought back and pushed back and like resisted, and then the Second World War comes along and suddenly
Mm,
workers have much more power, but they were able to mobilize because of that pre-existing organizing that allowed them to then make all these demands. And after the war, that was what put in place the conditions for, social democracy in the UK, and those kind of boom years, those boom post-war years in the US as well, when you did see like workers who were really well organized were able to demand higher wages, were able to kind of like really like bargain with bosses and with the state as to policy and as to the conditions that they were working under. Today, obviously, those conditions don't obtain. So even if we were in like an all-out mass war where people were being called up, conscripted to fight, it was like a whole society process that wouldn't translate into like probably it wouldn't translate into a reduction in inequality, because you would still have that like huge imbalance that exists between capital and labor. And actually, in some senses, war would kind of make that worse because it creates this narrative of people have to sacrifice for the greater good and all that sort of stuff that we see, still deployed all the time. But really, the thing that's changed throughout the history of war, Rutger Bregman, and in his book Humankind, has a really interesting section on this. He's basically like, throughout the history of modern warfare, the biggest challenge that military commanders have had is getting people to kill each other who don't like killing. There are not very many people in any society who like killing, even their enemies. Killing is not a nice thing to do. And like most of the time, the most successful armies get you to do that, not because you like hate the enemy, but because you want to protect the people next to you, right? And so the whole process of like the development of militaries in the rich world has been, how do we take the person who's doing the killing and put them as far away from that killing as possible? And this obviously reaches its apogee with kind of drone warfare. And you even see this with the way that the conflict is being presented to ordinary people. The kind of like the visual that the US and Israel are putting out on social media are reminiscent of like a video game. The idea is to make you feel like we're involved in a video game. And that is the idea that's also being spread amongst the people who are actually fighting this war and the troops who are kind of involved in using these technologies. And the other impact of that, obviously, is that it automates war. Like the automation of war is not just a process that's driven by technological change. It's driven by this need to separate the killer from the person being killed. That's just it's reached another level in recent years. And it has been huge arms manufacturers that have made extraordinary sums of money off the back of those technological improvements. But what's also been interesting in recent years is that we have seen the limit of that form of kind of technologically advanced warfare. And in Russia, now in Iran, in like a few other places, the kind of response to that has been this like low tech, kind of like throwing sand in the wheels of the machine approach to asymmetric warfare, which has made a lot of those tools less effective. So yeah, like we have, countries like the US have tried to basically like automate warfare, but there are limits to that. And even now, you've seen the limits to that in this war. The US spending, like it was at the start, I think $2 billion a day trying to just take out all the missiles and all the drones that were being pushed out by Iran, and realizing, oh, we can't do this forever. Like we can't just, rely on the idea that we have this big iron dome and we can protect ourselves just using technology. It's actually just, it
Yeah.
doesn't work long term.
So this war as a video game is such a, kind of dangerous framing, right?
Mm,
And I think it makes it easier in some ways to start a war too, because it feels very devoid. It doesn't feel like we're maybe putting
yeah.
people on your side in harm's way. Um, and I think there's this other narrative, that I see a lot in like these inequality circles, that I run in, which is like the opportunity cost of war in some ways too, right? These, three F-15s, right, that got blown,
Mm,
shot down by friendly fire over Kuwait. Like how many, you know, snap, right, dollars that would have been able to provide, right? Like this goal, right, that we were sold of America first and building out this like fantastic economy, all of, right, it's $1.2 million to fire one Tomahawk
yeah.
missile. Like, how much could that go towards an infrastructure project, to bringing jobs back to the US, towards, setting people up with, new housing or vouchers? And although like we know that government budgets, like the dollars aren't always fungible, right, in that same way, but this, right, thinking about like what are some of the goals that we were sold, these narratives that were being told, and our ability to live up to them or not, it feels like we are seeing like this huge separation from them. I know also your kind of book and some of your writing is also focused on this like individualistic, right, challenge and this
Mm,
narrative that we're seeing too. And you talked a bit about like that shift, right, of strong, groups, unions, like, large narratives that kind of kept people together kind of in World War II, where we've now much more so shifted towards this like individualistic narrative and like
mm.
pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, right? And this underlying logic of capitalism and this focus on individualism. So can you talk a bit about like where you have seen things kind of like been really challenging on this individualism front, and maybe some areas where like it has been, beneficial in some areas too. And I know also you have like a interesting global perspective on that too.
Yeah. So this is it's really what I'm writing about at the moment. Because I think this our kind of inability or our struggle to um kind of organize and present a united front in the context of having leaders who basically have just dropped any pretense of really caring about like the vast majority of people, I would say. The strength of someone like Trump, the strength of the far right across Europe is in some ways basically saying we don't care about people who can't afford to look after themselves because we live in a market economy and we are for the kind of high value people who struggle and compete and push each other out of the way to get to the top. We are for the strong, and this really links in with that whole kind of like
Yeah.
culture of toxic masculinity, I guess, amongst all the Andrew Tates of this world who are like, if you can't compete, you're weak and, you don't deserve anything. And like you have to portray strength in order to deserve um to be able to live basically, and its strength portrayed in this like very, very rigid sense. And I think in my view and in my work, I trace that rise of this like individualistic, competitive, harsh idea of what it means to be strong and how that shows up in politics with the decline of the social movements that used to represent people as a collective to be able to push their interests and to be able to demand things from our politicians. As the labor movement's broken down, as social movements have broken down, as politics has just become much more concentrated in like, Westminster and DC, it has been harder for people to imagine how they might get together with their neighbors, with their co-workers, with their fellow citizens to say, this isn't good enough. We want something to be different. And that's been, associated with a whole bunch of things like the rise of neoliberal market ideology that does tell us you are isolated, atomized individuals competing to survive. It's associated with direct attacks on the trade union movement and on the labor movement. It is associated with the rise of this kind of like reactionary politics that tells us, we are alone and we have to fight to maintain our fragile position in society. And I really do think that, especially at moments like this, you can see that the only way to fight back against this kind of just like nihilistic Trumpist project, which is basically just like it is the offer to everyone is basically like just don't do anything. I will protect you. I am the supreme leader. I am the patriarch. I will like look after you so you don't have to look after yourselves. The only really way to like fight back against that is to get people organizing and recognizing that, like, no, Trump is not going to save you, but neither is any political leader going to save you. Like, no one is coming to save you. Like, if we want this war to stop, if we want higher wages, if we want better living standards, we're going to have to organize and fight for them. And that's really where like combating individualism comes in, because you have to be able to stop seeing yourself as I am my one little isolated household with my one 401k and, like my position in this competitive hierarchy. And instead start thinking, okay, I'm part of a society. I'm part of a system of basically in which I'm being exploited and screwed over by people at the top. And I need to figure out how I can start working with other people again to hold those in power to account.
Yeah, this is a perfect, I think, segue to our, kind of final question that we always wrap up with on, kind of American inequality, which is the path forward, right? In some ways, like we have painted a very, kind of grim picture of the world. War will will do that to
Mm.
a person, and kind of these, fractures that we're seeing in the economy, rising, prices, challenging labor markets, uncertainty, about what central banks are going to do, and how a small group of people might get very rich on the backs of, incredible, global pain. But I think that there is, change that we can make, right? And I think you've alluded to a bit already on collective power, right? What can we do, kind of together? And so if you can talk a bit, whether it's, things that we can do as individuals or nonprofits or calling policymakers or working with politicians, like what are some ways that you have seen to be effective for making sure that we, are able to, combat some of these wrongs and try to reduce, inequality or uncertainty or these, really grim realities that I think many of us are concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what I'm researching now for my next book. But the thing I always like to say is we need to figure out ways to organize ourselves in our communities and our workplaces and on the streets. And that's really just a shorthand for saying we need community organizing. So that can look like getting involved in a tenants union. It can look like, joining a campaign to save your local library. It can look like getting involved in local politics. It can look like a cooperative. Like there's so much stuff going on in the kind of community economy, and that's where I'm doing a lot of my research now because there's a real diversity of movements that you can get involved in. But it really starts with again like thinking about being in a place, being in a community, and linking up with people who share your values and figuring out how to make that place better for everyone. The second is obviously the workplace, right? Trade unions are still so important. When we're talking about inequality, we know that trade union density is associated with lower levels of inequality. We know it's associated with like a better labor share of national income. If we're going to deal with inequality, the labor movement is, I would argue, the key thing. Now,
Mm,
obviously, there's a real struggle in the US right now because of Trump's attacks um on the labor movement and on like the NLRB. But workers can still organize, and they have still been organizing and still fighting within a number of different sectors. And I've been speaking to them, sectors that people thought was really hard to organize, like Starbucks workers, and been talking to like railroad workers and all these people across all these different sectors of the economy, coming together and thinking about like, right, okay, what does the labor movement look like today? And someone who's done some really excellent work on that is Eric Blanc, who I think has a Substack, and I've read his book a while ago. We Are
yeah.
Union, great book. So the labor movement, and then on the streets, which is like getting out there and protesting. It is organizing within political parties as well to put forward great candidates because there are some great candidates in the US right now. Zoran won. James Tallarico makes my heart
Yeah.
sing. Like there are some great people doing awesome stuff. And yeah, we need to be organizing to kind of push them, not from this mentality of like these are the people who are going to rescue us, but as the mentality of these are people who genuinely represent us and our interests. And we can't keep electing people who don't give a shit about us and are just going to ignore us as soon as they get into office. So yeah, that's my outline. But wait for the book to hear more.
Yeah, I am incredibly excited, for the book and to share it out, kind of on the, Substack and see it, kind of on yours too. And I think, yeah, this work, right, that we can do in communities, workplaces and streets feels really, actionable, right? And I want to,
Mm.
extra highlight this focus of like the power of place in that, right? What
Mhm.
you can do in your community, because that is where so many of these like injustices show up, right? They happen
Yeah.
in schools, right, in jobs, kind of like from one zip code to the next. And there are things that we can do, right? It is proven in data. We understand it, right? We know what works and what doesn't. And at a time where it feels like we're maybe just waiting for these people in these ivory towers to change interest rates or to make these policy changes or understand what is going to, happen with a global war, for us to be able to actually act on it in the meantime and elect people who, show our interests feels really powerful. So Grace, thank you so much for joining us. I know you said you kind of live near, kind of the coast in Cornwall. I hope you're able to like go and surf, this afternoon or tomorrow morning and just like wash away, so much of this. But it was such a joy having you, and we're looking forward to having you back hopefully soon.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. We'll have to do it again. I want you to come on my Substack so I can interview you as well.
It sounds like a date. Perfect. All right.
Great. Thanks so much. Speak soon. Bye.
Yeah. Bye, Grace.